When a cocky judge ridicules a quiet teenager in court, thinking he's just a lost kid, the room bursts into laughter. But the smirks vanish fast. This teen isn't who he seems. What follows is a courtroom showdown that flips power, pride, and the meaning of justice on its head. The courtroom buzzed with the familiar murmur of pretrial chatter. Lawyers shuffled paperwork, defendants whispered nervously to family members, and the sharp click of polished shoes echoed down the marble hallway outside. Judge Ronald Gable's courtroom was packed. It wasn't an unusual morning for the Superior Court of Franklin County, but something strange happened the moment Elijah King walked in. He wasn't supposed to be there, at least. That's what everyone thought. He entered quietly, no suit, no tie, just a plain black hoodie, dark jeans, and a beat-up gray backpack. He looked like a high school student who'd gotten lost on his way to class. At most, maybe a teenager coming to support a family member. But Elijah didn't sit in the gallery. He walked straight toward the bar, the invisible line between spectators and participants, and stood behind the defense table. The guard's 10 said an older man in a fraying army jacket, seated at the table, glanced over and stiffened in surprise. This was James Porter, a 52-year-old Gulf War veteran accused of armed robbery falsely. Elijah believed with every fiber of his being. Judge Gable raised an eyebrow, then looked up from the docket. "Excuse me, young man," he said, leaning slightly forward. "I think you're in the wrong place. This isn't high school civics day. Who are you here for?" A light chuckle ran through the room. Elijah didn't flinch. "I'm here for Mr. Porter, Your Honor," he replied evenly. "I'm his attorney of record." The room paused, silence, then laughter, louder this time. Someone in the back snorted. The court clerk actually smiled and shook her head. Even the bailiff turned slightly, hand hovering near his radio. Gable leaned back, resting one elbow on the arm of his seat. "You're Mr. Porter's what now?" "Attorney of record," Elijah repeated, calm as ever. Gable chuckled. "Well, unless you're carrying that bar card in your little backpack there, I suggest you find your seat before you get in some real trouble." Elijah reached into his backpack and pulled out a black leather wallet. From it, he slid a card, forward, perfectly smooth. He walked to the bench and placed it on the wooden rail before the judge. Bar number 1,170,237. Elijah Michael King, licensed in this state and federally recognized, sworn in 8 months ago under the Exceptional Admissions Program. Gable picked up the card slowly, as if it might be fake or a prank, but the laminate was real. The number checked out. His face twitched. Then, with disbelief lacing every syllable, he asked, "How old are you?" 17, Your Honor, Elijah replied. 18, next month? You're telling me, Gable said, half laughing, that this court is supposed to accept that a teenager in a hoodie is about to represent a man accused of armed robbery. "I'm not asking the court to accept anything except evidence," Elijah said quietly, "which is more than the prosecution brought." For a full 3 seconds, no one moved. Then Gable laughed, a slow, almost mocking sound that rippled outward. "Well, this should be interesting." The courtroom, still half in disbelief, moved into session. Elijah sat beside Mr. Porter, whose confused expression hadn't left his face. "Are you sure about this?" Porter whispered. "No offense, kid, but you look like you should be running track, not defending my life." Elijah turned, looked him square in the eyes. "I've read every page of your case file, every line in the discovery packet. The footage, it's been misinterpreted. The fingerprints, inconclusive. The police lineup, improperly administered. I know this case better than the prosecution does." Porter stared, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "Just trust me," Elijah said. Case, State v. Porter, was simple on the surface, a robbery at a convenience store on the east side of town. Security footage showed a man in a hooded jacket, mask, and gloves entering the store and pointing what appeared to be a gun at the cashier. The robber made off with $412 and disappeared on foot. Porter, who lived nearby and had previous minor offenses, was stopped and arrested an hour later. The only physical evidence, a shaky eyewitness and a vague resemblance, but Elijah had spent weeks dissecting every frame of that video. The man in it, taller, leaner, the gait, different, the timing, impossible, given where Porter had been. None of this mattered, though, if no one listened. During a recess before opening statements, Judge Gable called Elijah to the bench. "Listen, son," he said in a low tone. "I don't know what kind of stunt you're trying to pull, but I'm not here for some TikTok courtroom fantasy. This isn't a game. That man's life is on the line." "I'm aware, Your Honor." Gable's voice turned cold. "Then act like it, and maybe show a little respect. Show up tomorrow in a tie, at least." Elijah didn't respond. He returned to the table, picked up his legal pad, and continued writing. Flashback. 3 years earlier, Elijah sat alone in a battered public library in South Franklin, hunched over a borrowed copy of Criminal Procedure and Evidence. He was 14, in foster care, living with a woman who barely acknowledged his existence. Most kids his age were at football practice or wasting time on social media. But Elijah had discovered a different obsession, the law. It started the day his best friend Marcus was arrested for a crime he didn't commit and was sentenced without a competent defense. Elijah had watched the trial, sitting in the back, seething with helplessness as the system swallowed his friend whole. That night, he went home and downloaded every free legal textbook he could find. He studied like a man possessed: contracts, torts, civil rights law. He emailed law professors questions late at night. Some ignored him, but a few responded. One, Dr. Ellen Cho from Columbia, recognized his brilliance and began sending him more advanced materials. By age 15, Elijah had already passed the LS with a near-perfect score. Through a rarely used state program, the Exceptional Admissions Program for Juvenile Prodigies, he was admitted to a legal apprenticeship, bypassing traditional law school. 8 months ago, he took and passed the state bar exam, but his journey to the courtroom hadn't prepared him for this. Back in the present, the trial moved forward. The prosecutor, Ada Kenneth Morrow, smirked as he stood to deliver his opening remarks. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, gesturing to the jury, "this should be a simple case. You'll see video footage, you'll hear testimony, you'll learn about a man with motive and opportunity, and you'll reach the only logical conclusion that Mr. Porter committed this robbery." Elijah rose when it was his turn. His voice was soft but carried. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, walking slowly toward them, "today, you'll be asked to do something harder than just watching a video or hearing a statement. You'll be asked to think critically. You'll be shown a story, but I'll show you the truth underneath it. You'll be told this man is guilty, but I'll prove he was set up, misidentified, and judged unfairly by the system." He paused, eyes locked with the jury. "What you decide today isn't just about Mr. Porter. It's about whether we still believe in facts over fear, truth over assumption, and justice over convenience." It wasn't a performance, it was a promise. As witnesses took the stand, Elijah held his ground. Gable interrupted him, overruled valid objections, and warned him multiple times for improper courtroom decorum. But he never backed down. He caught the prosecution's first witness, the store clerk, in a contradiction about the robber's height. Then he introduced time-stamped security footage from a bus station across town that showed Porter at the terminal within minutes of the robbery, impossible if he'd committed the crime. Even the jury began to notice. Outside the courtroom, rumors spread. Who was this kid in the hoodie? Was he a fake? A genius? Reporters began to trickle in, hoping to catch a glimpse of what some were calling the teen lawyer. On the third day of the trial, during cross-examination of the arresting officer, Elijah made his first major move. "You stated that you apprehended Mr. Porter based on probable cause from the security footage," Elijah said, pacing slowly. "Did you review the timestamp?" "Yes," the officer replied. "Did you compare that with the traffic camera footage I subpoenaed from South 9th Street? "Ah, I wasn't aware that footage existed." "Exactly," Elijah said, turning to the jury, "because if you had, you'd know my client was walking his dog 3 blocks away at the exact moment the robbery occurred." He handed the footage to the bailiff, who played it on the court's screen. Their Porter was time-stamped, dog leash in hand. Smiling and talking to a neighbor, the jury stirred. Judge Gable frowned. Elijah sat down, and for the first time, everyone in the room realized this case wasn't a joke. At the end of the session, Gable called the court to recess. Before leaving the bench, he stared hard at Elijah, then spoke. "Mr. King, would you approach the bench?" Elijah rose and walked forward. The judge studied him, the laughter gone. "Where did you learn to argue like that?" Elijah didn't smile. "The system taught me. I just paid attention." Gable looked away. "Court resumes tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Sharp. Bring your A-game. I always do." As Elijah returned to his seat, the courtroom watched him differently now, not as a boy who didn't belong, but as a force none of them had seen coming. And the trial had only just begun. The next morning, the sun had barely crept over the Franklin County Courthouse when a small crowd had already gathered outside. Word had gotten around. The teen lawyer was real, and he was changing the game. Inside courtroom 4B, the atmosphere had shifted. What was once mockery now felt like anticipation. The laughter was gone, replaced by murmurs and sidelong glances. Reporters angled their phones discreetly. Even the bailiff, who had smirked 2 days earlier, now greeted Elijah King with a subtle nod of respect. Elijah walked in exactly the same as before, hoodie, jeans, backpack, but today, he didn't look like a kid out of place. He looked like a man on a mission. Judge Gable entered and struck the gavel. "Court is now in session. Counsel, you may call your next witness." The prosecution stood. Ada Kenneth Morrow, tall and smug in his $1,000 suit, approached the bench like he owned it. He was seasoned, sharp, and quietly furious that a teenager had stolen the room's attention. Worse, Elijah had made him look unprepared. Today, he was determined to reclaim control. "I'd like to call Officer Melanie Ruiz to the stand," Morrow said. Elijah's eyes narrowed. He'd expected this. Ruiz had been the first officer to process James Porter's arrest. She was well-liked in the department, a 10-year veteran, and known for her near-photographic memory. Morrow is trying to solidify the arrest's credibility. "Officer." Ruiz took the stand confidently. Morrow began. "Officer Ruiz, can you describe what you observed the night of the robbery?" "Yes," she replied. "I was on patrol on East Lenox when I received a dispatch about an armed robbery. The suspect was described as a black male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a hoodie and dark pants. I turned onto Ash Street and spotted Mr. Porter walking at a fast pace. Morrow nodded. Did he match the description? In my opinion, yes. He also appeared nervous. And what did you do next? I conducted a stop and asked for identification. When he couldn't explain where he'd come from, I detained him and read him his rights. Morrow smiled at the jury, then turned. No further questions. Elijah rose slowly. He didn't pace like Morrow. He didn't need to. He approached Ruiz with quiet precision. Officer Ruiz, Elijah began, how long have you been on the force? 10 years. In that time, how many suspects have you arrested based on a vague physical description and proximity to the crime scene? Ruiz shifted slightly. Dozens, I suppose. It's standard procedure when there's probable cause, right? And would you agree that East Lenox is a predominantly black neighborhood? Morrow objected. Relevance. Elijah looked to the judge, establishing systemic bias. Your Honor goes to credibility of the identification. Gable, still trying to assert control over the boy he once mocked, hesitated, then nodded. Overruled. Proceed. Elijah turned back to Ruiz. Would you say the majority of black males in that neighborhood fit the description you were given? Tall, dark hoodie, dark pants? I suppose that's fair, she said reluctantly. And yet you picked Mr. Porter. Was that before or after backup was called? Before. Did you find a weapon on him? No. Stolen money? No. Was he running? No. Just walking fast. Did he resist? No. And the timestamp on the store's security footage, did you compare it to the moment you stopped Mr. Porter? Ruiz hesitated. No. I didn't have access to that footage yet. So you had no way of knowing whether he could even physically have committed the robbery before detaining him. Ruiz looked down. Correct. Elijah paused, letting the silence settle. Then, softly, thank you, officer. He walked back to the defense table, letting the weight of that exchange speak for itself. Outside the courtroom, the story exploded. Clips of Elijah's cross-examinations were circulating online. Hashtags like #TeenLawyer and #ElijahKing trended on local Twitter feeds. Media outlets were now requesting interviews, all of which Elijah declined. I'm not here to be a star, he told the reporter. I'm here to prove the system got it wrong. Back in the courtroom, Morrow brought out his star witness, a man named Rodney Hale, an ex-convict turned store security consultant. He claimed to have enhanced the surveillance footage and positively identified James Porter. Rodney sat with a slick confidence. He'd testified in court before and knew how to perform, Morrow asked. Can you tell us how you analyzed the footage? I used a forensic video enhancement program, Hale said, that let me isolate the subject's body proportions and gait. From my analysis, I'm confident it was the defendant. Morrow beamed. And how confident are you? 85%. Elijah stood, but this time he carried a tablet. Mr. Hale, Elijah said, you mentioned a forensic video program. Which one? Exactly. AVS Presume 7. Interesting, Elijah said, tapping his screen. Because according to the company's own documentation, AVS Presume 7 is designed for enhancing audio, not for gait analysis or frame comparison. Hale shifted. Well, we also used other tools. Which ones? I'd have to check. You're under oath, Elijah reminded him. If you cannot name the software you used to claim an 85% match that could put a man in prison, I suggest you retract your statement. Morrow objected, badgering. Gable blinked, then, surprisingly, shook his head. Overruled, answered the question. Rodney Hale hesitated. I can't recall the exact software. Elijah nodded. Then let the record reflect that. The witness's confidence in his analysis is unsupported by verifiable methods. He sat down. Morrow looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. During the lunch recess, Elijah sat alone in a quiet stairwell with his earbuds in, not listening to music, but reviewing audio notes from a mentor, Professor Ellen Cho. Never let them define your courtroom style, she'd said in one file. You're not there to impress them. You're there to make them see. He breathed deeply. It was working, but he couldn't afford to lose focus. By the fourth day, Judge Gable's demeanor had changed. He still had his edge, but he no longer mocked Elijah. In fact, more often than not, he ruled in his favor, or at least gave him a fair chance to argue. That afternoon, Elijah called his own surprise witness, Laura Jensen, a clerk at the local bus station. She testified that she remembered seeing James Porter at the terminal shortly after the time of the robbery. More importantly, she remembered the dog. He had this little Jack Russell Terrier, she said, kept licking my hand while I printed his ticket. Cutest thing. Remember what time that was? Just before 9 p.m. I remember because my shift ends at 9 o'clock and I was already packing up. The robbery had occurred at 8:53 p.m., 5 blocks away. Could Mr. Porter have traveled that distance in under 7 minutes? With a dog? While fleeing from a robbery? Morrow objected. Speculative. Sustained, Gable said. But the point had landed. Elijah's final move of the day was his boldest. He called the lead detective to the stand and asked, point blank, were you under any pressure from your department to close this case quickly? The detective blinked. We always want to close cases quickly. And were there internal concerns about rising robbery statistics in East Franklin? That's not relevant. I think it is, Elijah said. Because when we pressure detectives to prioritize stats over facts, we end up with shortcuts that cost innocent people their freedom. The jury listened, more engaged than ever. As the day closed, Gable offered an unexpected comment from the bench. Counsel, he said, looking at Elijah, I'll admit I was skeptical at first. But I've never seen someone your age, or, frankly, any age handle a case quite like this. Elijah nodded but didn't smile. This isn't about me, Your Honor, he said. It's about Mr. Porter. Gable glanced at the older man seated beside Elijah, a veteran who had sat through days of trial with his shoulders hunched, head bowed. But now Porter looked up, eyes alive with hope. The judge nodded. Court is adjourned until closing arguments. The gavel fell. The courtroom didn't just disperse, it buzzed with electricity. A young man had entered this building as a punchline. He was leaving as the defense's best chance at justice. Outside, as the crowd filtered into the fading afternoon light, one journalist asked a question over the crowd. Elijah, what drives you? He paused, turned, and said just loud enough for the microphones to catch it. Injustice. I grew up watching people lose to a system that didn't care if they were right or wrong. I'm here to change that, one case at a time. Then he disappeared into the evening, ready for the final round. The courtroom was silent the following morning, as though the very walls were holding their breath. It was the final day of State v. Porter, and what had started as a curious novelty, a teenager representing a man accused of armed robbery, had evolved into something profound. No one dared snicker anymore. The boy in the hoodie, Elijah King, had earned not only the courtroom's respect, but its attention. And now, all eyes were on him for the final battle. Closing arguments, Judge Ronald Gable entered from his chambers, straight-faced and stoic, though something in his eyes had softened. His gaze moved quickly to Elijah, whose posture was calm but focused. The young man sat beside James Porter, flipping through a neatly tabbed binder page after page of evidence, testimony, contradictions. Everything he needed was there. Yet, his mind was elsewhere. He wasn't thinking about performance or fame. He was thinking about Marcus, his childhood friend, and how no one had fought for him like this. Elijah was here now to make sure someone did. Are both sides ready? To proceed? Judge Gable asked, voice cutting cleanly across the room. Ada Kenneth Morrow stood, straightening his designer tie with one final tug. Yes, Your Honor, Elijah nodded. Ready? Morrow approached the jury first. He had rehearsed this speech for hours the night before. His tone was slow, deliberate, polished, but sharp. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about emotion. It's not about courtroom theatrics or the novelty of who's at the defense table. It's about evidence. Cold, hard facts. We have a store clerk who identified Mr. Porter, an expert who matched the surveillance footage, and an arrest made within an hour of the crime. He paused, then continued. You saw the footage. You heard the testimonies. Can there be doubt? Perhaps, but reasonable doubt? No. The state believes, and we ask you to believe, that Mr. Porter committed this crime. He gave a slight nod to the jury and returned to his seat. Now it was Elijah's turn. He rose, the room still, and watching. Even the keystroke seemed to slow. Elijah walked to the front of the jury box, not with the swagger of a showman, but the calm gravity of someone who bore the weight of another man's future. He paused, looked each juror in the eyes, and began. You've been told this case is about evidence, he said. Let's talk about that. What is evidence? Is it a blurry video? A mismatched witness description? An expert who couldn't name the software he used to draw conclusions about a man's freedom? He paced slowly, hands behind his back. Mr. Morrow wants you to ignore the inconsistencies, to believe that because something looks a certain way, it must be true. But you've seen what that kind of thinking leads to. You heard Officer Ruiz admit she detained Mr. Porter without verifying his alibi. You watched as the expert witness crumbled under examination. You heard from Ms. Jensen, the bus station clerk, that Mr. Porter was across town, walking his dog, at the very time the robbery took place. He turned to James Porter. This is a man who served our country, who came back and struggled like so many veterans do, who was caught in the wrong place, at the wrong time, by a system that too often assumes guilt instead of proving it. He faced the jury again. You are the final line of defense. You are the firewall between assumption and justice. And right now, someone's life, someone who has already been overlooked by the world, rests in your hands. Elijah stepped back. I ask you, no, I beg you to look at the facts, to follow the law, and to send a message that justice isn't about appearances. It's about truth. Then, simply, he returned to his seat. The courtroom remained frozen for a moment after he sat, the gravity of his words still hanging in the air like mist. Judge Gable gave his final instructions to the jury, a series of careful legal directions about burden of proof, reasonable doubt, and impartiality. As he spoke, Elijah didn't listen, not really. His heart was pounding now, not from fear, but from hope. He'd done everything he could. Now it was up to 12 strangers. The jury filed out, and then the waiting began. 3 hours passed in the hallway. Reporters tried to sneak interviews with spectators. Strangers murmured about Elijah's performance. He's got a future at the Supreme Court. Someone whispered. No, he'll run for Congress, said another. But Elijah sat alone in a corner of the waiting room, eyes on the floor, fists clenched on his knees. Beside him, Mr. Porter sat silently, his expression unreadable. He hadn't said a word in over an hour. Then, the bailiff stepped out. We have a verdict. The hallway snapped into silence. People stood. Phones were tucked away. Elijah looked up slowly. Porter exhaled and stood, as if lifting a lifetime of weight. Back inside the courtroom, the jury had taken their places. Judge Gable looked unusually stiff. Madam Foreperson, he said, has the jury reached a unanimous verdict? The lead juror, a woman in her 40s, stood with the paper in her hand. We have, Your Honor. She handed the verdict slip to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. He read it carefully, blinked once, then handed it back. In the case of State of Franklin v. James Porter, on the charge of armed robbery, how do you find the defendant? The foreperson read clearly. Not guilty? A sound part gasp, part sigh, swept through the room. Porter froze, then blinked, then turned slowly to Elijah, eyes watering. I'm free, he asked, barely above a whisper. Elijah smiled for the first time that week. You're free. Morrow stared at the table, defeated. Judge Gable, for the first time, allowed the hint of a smile. He struck the gavel once. The defendant is acquitted of all charges. This court is adjourned. Porter collapsed into Elijah's arms. The boy held him firmly, no longer just his attorney, but the only person in that system who had fought for him, truly, fully. Outside the courthouse, the scene had changed entirely. News vans lined the sidewalk. The crowd had doubled. Cheer erupted as Elijah emerged with Porter at his side. Reporters swarmed, but he kept walking. Head down. Mr. King, how does it feel to win your first trial? Are you really 17? What will you do next? He paused at the top of the courthouse steps, turned to the crowd, and raised his voice just enough to be heard. I didn't win anything, he said. Justice did. This wasn't about me. It was about a man who never should have been in that courtroom in the first place. There are more out there like him. I plan to find them. Then he helped Porter down the steps and into freedom. That night, Elijah returned to his tiny apartment, a space no bigger than a dorm room, filled with law books, ramen wrappers, and sticky notes on the wall with words like due process and presumption of innocence, scribbled in bold Sharpie. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began drafting a letter. Dear Governor Pierce, I am writing to formally request the establishment of a statewide review panel for wrongful convictions. My proposal is backed by evidence from State v. Porter and the inconsistencies exposed during trial. Justice should not be a gamble, and freedom should never depend on who can afford a good lawyer. I'm 17, but I've already seen enough. Lives destroyed to know. We need change. Sincerely, Elijah M. King-esque. He clicked send, then leaned back, exhausted. His phone buzzed. A message from Professor Cho. I watched the verdict live. You made history today. I'm proud of you, he smiled, then replied, thanks, Professor. One down, thousands to go. In the months that followed, Elijah's story went national. Interview requests flooded in. Universities offered honorary degrees. Law firms called with job offers. He declined them all. He wasn't interested in fame. He had work to do. With a small team of like-minded advocates, Elijah founded Justice Redefined, a legal clinic dedicated to representing low-income defendants, investigating wrongful convictions, and advocating for court reform. Within a year, they had overturned 5 more cases, each one exposing flaws in the system, each one led by a teenager who never should have had to take on the system alone. But did and Judge Gable? He retired 6 months after the trial, but not before giving one final speech at the Franklin County Judicial Conference. I once laughed at a boy in a hoodie who walked into my courtroom claiming to be a lawyer, he said. He didn't just change my mind. He changed the way I see justice. He paused, then smiled. His name is Elijah King, and mark my words, he's just getting started.